Welcome, everyone, to our Bible study. We appreciate so much you joining in with us and being a part of our study together. We're going to be in the book of 2 Corinthians. We're continuing our study through that book. And the last part of chapter 8, we'll start down around verse 15 or so. Then we'll back up a little bit and then pick up there and talk about the last part of that chapter. As we mentioned in our last lesson, this chapter of 2 Corinthians really focuses in on giving, and Paul has some very important things, of course, to write about giving, and some lessons that we need to think about and we need to learn even today concerning our giving. And so we started looking at that in our last lesson, and we're going to continue it here in this one at the end of chapter 8, and then it will go on, of course, into chapter 9. So what I want to do to start is to talk about, we mentioned this last time, when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, the book of 1 Corinthians, at the end of that book, he gave them instructions about giving. And what he's writing now in 2 Corinthians is building on what he had originally taught them and what they had originally agreed to, that they were going to give to help those who were in need in Jerusalem. And so Paul is encouraging them to follow through with what they committed to do, but also with the keeping of the commands of God. So in 1 Corinthians 16 in verse 1, he wrote, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order unto the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come." We talked about this in our last lesson, that Paul had given order, instructions to the churches of Galatia. He gave the same instructions to the church at Corinth. And where we are in 2 Corinthians 8, he's talking about the churches of Macedonia, which were Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. At least those three. Those are the three that we know of. And the point is that the instructions were the same for all congregations, as it always is with God's will. It's not different instructions for different people in different places and different times. It's always the same. God has one law, one set of rules. That, of course, is the gospel of Christ, and it applies equally to everyone, everywhere. But I want you to notice here in 1 Corinthians 16 that after Paul gives this command and instructs them about the collection, he says in verse number 3, "And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me." So Paul says, here's the instruction concerning giving. It's on the first day of the week. You lay by as God has prospered. That money is stored up, and then it will be used to do the Lord's work. This particular work was to help those who were in need in Jerusalem. And so he then tells them that's what they are to do on a weekly basis as the church comes together to worship. He says, when I come to you, then we're going to take this money, and whomsoever you approve by your letters, then they will go with the money to Jerusalem to make sure that it's handled correctly, to make sure that there's no dishonesty involved, but that your interest and your money is protected, and the work that you intend for it to do is what will be done with it. And so they would have someone from the congregation there who would go and travel with that money with the others to Jerusalem. And I wanted to read these verses because it's the next idea that Paul talks about in connection with giving, and a statement that he makes about providing honest things, or as he words it to the Romans, to provide things honest. And so we're going to talk about that. That's going to be kind of the central thought of our study today, providing things honest. And so we're going to talk about the importance of honesty, as Christians in general, in every aspect of our lives, but especially when it comes to money and the using of money, of the Lord's money, to do his work. Paul was very focused on that and very concerned about that, and rightly so, because we know and understand that dishonesty is not only a tremendous temptation, but a tremendous problem in our world. So when we just think about, the world around us, dishonesty is everywhere. We look in the political realm, right? And that's almost all you see is dishonesty. People say one thing and do something else, make promises that they don't keep. We see it so often in the political world that we become so cynical about it that we don't even expect politicians to be honest. And that's a shame on our part, that we need to hold people accountable to their word and to being honest with their word. But it's not just in the political realm. In the sports realm, how many times do teams get in trouble for cheating in whatever way, whether it's stealing signs or, using foreign substances and whatever, dishonesty in the sports world. We see it in every aspect of life. People, the business realm, all what the primary concern is, how can I make more money for me and get away with it? And so they're dishonest in their dealings with others. And everybody kind of says, well, this is just the way that it is. And so we wink at it or we go along with it. And it's, infiltrated every aspect of our world and our culture and our society. Someone said, honesty is the best policy. The truth is, for a Christian, honesty is the only policy. If we want to be followers of Christ, we must be honest. We have to be honest in all that we do. And that's especially true when it comes to finances and to money. And of course, obviously, when we're talking about the Lord's money, the contribution that is given to the church to be used to carry out the Lord's work. So we're going to focus in on that and talk about some of these things that Paul says. But to kind of build a foundation so we can, have the structure about honesty, I want us to go back to the very first chapter of 2 Corinthians and remind us of something important that Paul tells us about God and then about us, and that will help us to understand why Paul is emphasizing so much about giving. Okay? So in verse 1 of 2 Corinthians 1, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy our brother, under the church of God which is at Corinth, with all the saints which are in all Achaia, grace be to you and peace from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, remember what he says here in verse 3. Blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. And when we first started studying this book and when we first kind of reviewed it in this series of lessons, we talked about the twofold theme of the book of 2 Corinthians. One is Paul defending his apostleship. The other is that it's a message of comfort, of encouragement from God and from Paul to this congregation, after all that they've been through. Well, when Paul talks about God being the God of all comfort, he says that God comforts us in our tribulation, so we will then be able to comfort others who are in tribulation, troubling times, by the comfort that we have received from God. So God gives us comfort and consolation and encouragement, and that's good for us, and we're thankful for it, but we're supposed to then use that to help others learn about God and to find His way so they can receive comfort and consolation from Him in their difficult situation. So that's kind of the fundamental principle and theme that runs through the book of 2 Corinthians, along with Paul defending his authority as an apostle. And those two things go hand in hand throughout the book, as we've seen. But I wanted to mention that because sometimes in commentaries, for example, people write about the book of 2 Corinthians, they'll kind of take chapters 8 and 9 of this book and put it over here as though it doesn't really fit in. It's, its own separate thing. Paul was writing about this, and then he kind of goes off on this tangent about giving, and then he comes back to... But what is often misunderstood is that the church's giving is a direct application of the very theme of Paul's epistle. These Christians in Macedonia and in Achaia, so in Berea and Thessalonica and Philippi and Corinth, they all had been blessed and comforted by God. And because God had blessed them and comforted them by providing them the means of forgiveness of sins, by sustaining them through their persecutions and tests and trials, all the good things that God had done for them, put them in a position where they may not have had much materially, but what they had, they could use to extend the comfort that God had given them to others who were suffering. And that's exactly what Paul said we're supposed to do. So as we talked about in our last lesson, these churches in in Macedonia, which had gone through this time of persecution and tribulation and affliction. And Paul even talked about their deep poverty. In fact, let me just put it up on the screen just to remind us of it while we're thinking about it. He talked about the great trial of affliction there in verse 2, and he talks about their deep poverty, how that abounded under the riches of their liberality. They gave liberally because their focus was on God and His grace. And God had done all of these things for them, and now they had an opportunity to do those things for others. So Paul's teaching about giving here in the heart of this epistle is directly related to the point that he's emphasizing throughout this letter, that God is a God of comfort, but He comforts us so we can comfort others. So these congregations had been blessed. It was Christians from Jerusalem that came into these different parts of the world bringing the gospel to them. If the church in Jerusalem hadn't existed, then there would have been no one to go forth into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. These congregations in Gentile regions had been directly blessed by the church at Jerusalem. So the church at Jerusalem had blessed them. Now they have an opportunity to bless the church at Jerusalem. And that's why they gave. God comforts us, and now we have the privilege of comforting others. So in all those things that we talked about in our last lesson, there, how they were single-minded, focused, that word liberality, singly focused on what they were doing, on God's grace and who God is and what He'd done for them, how they were willing of themselves, how they first gave themselves to the Lord. All of those things are exactly what this entire letter is about. God has done this for us, therefore we're going to do these things for others. And that's why they gave, and that's why you and I should give. If God has blessed me, if God has blessed you, then it's our obligation and our privilege to be able to take those blessings that God has given us and use them to bless someone else. hopefully to bless them in such a way that they can become one of God's children and receive blessings from Him, then they can bless others. And by doing so, we spread the gospel into the world. Lost souls are saved. God is glorified. And that's ultimately what we're supposed to be about as Christians. So I wanted to take just a minute to emphasize that these two chapters and this focus on giving is absolutely a part, of what Paul was talking about in this book, in this epistle. And it's key for us to understand that so we can understand the motivation behind their giving, and it can be our motivation as well. So with that in mind, let's go down now to verse number 15, actually verse 14 in chapter 8. And I want to pick up here and make just a couple other points, and then we're going to talk about providing things honest. So at the end of our last study, verse 14 says, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. So we talked about how it's kind of like at this point in time, if you think about scales, the church at Jerusalem was suffering. They were in a drought and famine. So the blessings were more on the side of the church at Corinth, so the scales were not balanced. But they were going to take some of their blessings and send them to the church at Jerusalem so the scales would balance. There would be an equality. And in the future, when things were bad, for the churches in Greece, maybe they'd be better for Jerusalem and the scales might get out of balance, but the church at Jerusalem would help the church at Corinth and the scales would balance. That's how things work with God and with His people. And as demonstration of that, he quotes from the book of Exodus. There in verse 15, as it is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. And we understand that had to do with gathering manna. And so you think about during that time of the Old Testament, a person gathering manna, maybe it was an older person who went out to gather their manna for the day. And because they're older, maybe they had a bad back or whatever. They couldn't walk as fast. And so they weren't able to gather as much as someone who was younger and healthier and, able to do more. So when the end of the day, end of the gathering came and you went to measure, how much you had gathered, well, the person who had gathered more, because they were younger and healthier, had exactly an omer. And the person who had not gathered quite as much because they were older or unable, they had exactly an omer. And so God worked through His providence and it demonstrated this principle of equality. And it teaches us an important lesson when it comes to giving, that when we are blessed and we know of others who are in need, we have the privilege of giving to them. And when we do that, it's God working through us for this equality that Paul was talking about here. And so the church at Corinth could help the church at Jerusalem. The church at Jerusalem could help the churches of Galatia. The churches of Galatia could help the church at Rome. And on it goes. Wherever there's a need, we have the ability and the opportunity, thus the responsibility to help. And it's not just an obligation, but it's a privilege. And it's something that we ought to be thankful that God allows us to do, that we become an avenue through which He works. But there's another important principle I want us to think about in connection with this. And that is, it's the wisdom of God in the way that He has chosen for giving to work on a congregational level. There's an important principle that we need to think about here. So when we look at this verse of Scripture again, it says, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. And in verse 14, he talks about equality there. Now, here's an important principle to remember in connection with that. Sometimes, not sometimes, I guess all the time, there are members of a congregation who are more blessed financially than others. Sometimes there are members of the congregation that are poor. Sometimes there are members of a congregation that are wealthy. And there can very often be a great distance between the two as far as physical, blessings go, money goes. So what does God do in connection with that, in relation to that? Well, he says for the church to give individually, but the money is to be pooled together collectively. Okay? So when we back up in this chapter in verse 8, or chapter 8 rather, at verse 12, he says, "For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not." So I may only have $100 in the bank, and brother so-and-so may have $1,000 in the bank. I'm not required to give as much as this brother does who has so much more than I do. I give as God has prospered me. But what happens is when the wealthier brother gives his amount and the poorer brethren give their amount, it all comes together in one common collection. And then when there's trouble in Jerusalem, the church at Corinth sends this money to help the church at Jerusalem. And they ask, where did this money come from? And the answer is it came from the church at Corinth. It's not, it came from this wealthy brother of the church at Corinth who has all this money, and look at, how generous he is that he gave this to you. No, it came from the church as a whole, as a body. Everyone contributes his or her part, but the church as a whole receives the honor, the glory. And when the church is glorified, of course, God is glorified. And so there's no embarrassment for the poor brother. There's no pride or bragging from the rich brother, because it doesn't matter how much each person has given. It matters that the church gave, and the church provided this. And this is how God set up giving in the church. And it's a beautiful arrangement because it allows everyone to participate and to be a part, and everyone to be just as much a part as everyone else, whether you're rich or poor or in the middle or whatever. Because it's not about the amount, it's about the heart. And it's about the fact that you gave, that you participated, that you took part in it. So that's why it's on the first day of the week, when the entire congregation has assembled together for worship, that's when the collection is taken up. Because it's the whole congregation that is involved. Individually, as we've been prospered, but it becomes one collective contribution. And so when that money is used to do the work of the church, then the church does that work. The church is honored. The church is glorified. And everyone who's a member of that congregation is a part of that work. Now, here's what happens sometimes. We have a special need arise or something, and so we take up a special contribution. And for whatever reason it may be, sometimes when a missionary may come and visit, they may mention some work or whatever, and they ask if we can take up, a special contribution. And here's the problem with that. What if this poor brother has already given, as he normally does on the first day of the week, and he's giving as God has prospered him, and he doesn't have any more money to give to this special need that has arisen, right? So he's not able to give. But another brother who may be more wealthy or maybe not, maybe just for whatever reason on this occasion, he's able to give some, and so he does, and these other brethren do. Well, when that money then goes to that work, who is a part of that work? Well, it's all these people over here who gave, but not me, because I didn't have any money to give. And so what we've done is taken someone who, through no fault of their own, and not someone who's done something wrong, not that they didn't want to give, but they'd already given to the church as they're supposed to, and we've excluded them. We're all a part of this work because we gave, we had extra and more than you, and you're not a part of it because you weren't able to contribute. What we need to understand is that when it comes to the work of the church, God has ordained that that work is to be financed by the contribution that is taken up on the first day of the week, because that's how the whole church is involved in the work. And I don't mean necessarily that it's wrong to have a special contribution for this or that. There may be occasions, when something like that happens. I think the best answer is that if there's a special need that the church needs to be involved in, then the elders need to make the decision that the church is going to help, but we're going to take it out of the contribution because that's where the money's supposed to come from. And if somebody wants to give extra to that, they can put it in their contribution on the first day of the week or whatever. It helps to eliminate, that process of shaming someone or embarrassing someone, or worst of all, excluding them from a work that they are a part of because they're a part of the congregation. You see, God's way of doing things is so simple and perfect that we sometimes mess it up with our, trying to, justify things or whatever. There are things that are not the work of the church that individual Christians may want to be involved in, that we contribute to. And that's, completely separate. If it's not a work of the church, then it doesn't have to be funded by the contribution. But God has organized the church this way so that everyone is involved. It's the same with every other part of our worship. When it comes to our singing, we don't pick out the best singers and let them stand before the congregation and sing to us as a choir or a solo or whatever, because that eliminates the rest of the congregation. We're not a part of the worship. We're not singing anymore. Everybody sings. If you can't carry a tune in a bucket, it doesn't matter. You sing anyway. And we all sing. And, the good voices and the bad voices, they blend together, and it's a joyful noise that's pleasing to the Lord. But everybody's involved. And that's true in every aspect of our worship. The Lord's Supper, of course, and with praying and with the preaching and teaching, and it has to be that way with our giving also. So I wanted to mention that and to kind of bring up the point, because I think it's worth thinking about that when Paul talks about that it's accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. And when he says, quotes from Exodus about those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no lack. We're all in this together, and it's a collection. And so we all give our parts, and then all those work together to accomplish God's will. And I think we need to remember how God set it up, and stick with what God says and what he wants us to do. Okay, so let's look a little further down into this chapter now. And I want to talk about providing things honest. And that kind of goes along with what we're talking about here. Honesty in our giving, and honesty in, using the Lord's money in the right way. So verse 16, he says, "But thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care into the heart of Titus for you. For indeed he accepted the exhortation, but being more forward of his own accord he went unto you. And we have sent with him the brother, whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace, which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord, and declaration of your ready mind, avoiding this, that no man should blame us in this abundance which is administered by us, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men." So let's talk about a couple of things here in connection with what Paul says. So obviously he's mentioned Titus earlier in the chapter, and he says here, he gives thanks to God that Titus had the same earnest care for the church at Corinth that Paul did. So Paul had sent Titus to check on the church at Corinth after he'd written this letter to them and to see how they were responding to it. And part of the reason for Paul sending Titus was also, as we saw earlier in the chapter, to encourage them to live up to their commitment concerning giving. Okay? So Paul said he exhorted Titus to go and to encourage them to do that. But he says, I didn't even need to encourage him to do it because he of his own accord went unto you. Because Titus loved the church at Corinth and he wanted to help them and encourage them and to make sure everything was okay with them. So we have another example here, just like the churches of Macedonia, of people who are doing what they're doing in service to God of their own accord. They do it willingly. They are glad to go and glad to serve and glad to give because they've given themselves to the Lord. Their primary focus in life is doing His will and helping His people. And so Titus is another example of that. Now he says in verse 18, we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. Now, who this brother is, we don't know. There's no way to know. Many commentators have made many guesses about who this brother was. I guess the most common or maybe accepted is that this was probably Luke, but there's no way to know if it's Luke. All we know is that it was a brother that Paul knew and that these Corinthians are now going to know that he sent with Titus. So he was a brother whose praise is in the gospel, meaning that he served in the gospel, and from the gospel perspective, he was praised for his faithfulness and his dedication and his service, and it was throughout all the churches. So all these different congregations knew of him. So obviously Paul had traveled to these congregations, Titus had, Luke probably had also, but it could have been any number of people. We just don't know for sure. But it was this brother. The point is that now you have Paul, and you have Titus, and you have another brother who's helping. Verse 19 says, not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace. So now there's another brother who was chosen by the churches to travel with them with this grace. And the word grace refers to the gift of grace. So this is the contribution. So the churches had selected someone to travel with the money and with the group who was carrying this money. So you have Titus, you have another brother, and you have another brother whose name we don't know and don't need to know, but you also have Paul. So there's four that are involved in this, the collecting of this money, and are going to be involved in taking it back to Jerusalem. Now, what's key is, number one, people knew Paul. They knew his reputation. They knew how he dealt with things. They knew his honesty. These Christians knew Titus, and they knew of his affection for them and his love for God and his desire to serve and to do God's will. The third brother who's mentioned, his praise is in the gospel throughout all churches. So everybody knew who he was, and they knew his reputation. And then there's a fourth brother that the church had specifically selected. So they knew who he was, and they had chosen them for this specific purpose of making sure this money was handled honestly and correctly. It's interesting when it says the one who was chosen of the churches. I forget. I think it's Adam Clark in his commentary, and maybe even Linsky in his definition of these words, but says that this is a word that has to do with being chosen by the raising of hands. So they voted on who is the right person to send with this money. And the congregation collectively selected this individual. So it's again a statement of honesty that this is the person you have chosen because you trust him, and he's going to go with us in the delivering and the care of this contribution. So he says, again, verse 19, who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace. I mentioned that word grace. Sometimes spiritual gifts are referred to by this word because they were gifts of grace. God's grace bestowed the gifts. Well, this is also a gift of grace, but this gift is the money. The grace is from God, who provided them with the means to earn a living, and now they've given a portion of their means to help those who were in need. And so that contribution becomes a grace, a gift of grace. And so they're going to travel with this group, with this grace, with this gift. And he says, which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord. So they're going to use it, but it's to the glory of God. And the end of the verse says, in declaration of your ready mind. So it's to God's glory, and it's a demonstration of your willingness to help your brothers in Christ. Okay? Now, in the next verse, verse 20, he says, avoiding this, that no man should blame us in this abundance which is administered by us. So avoiding this means, of course, this is something that Paul didn't want to happen. He didn't want there to be any cause of blame in relation to this money, this abundance of wealth. So to keep from being any opportunity for someone to say that there was any dishonesty involved, Paul made sure that the congregations who were giving money sent someone that they had chosen themselves to go with the money, so they could be an eyewitness to how it was handled, and that it got to the right destination, and all of those things. So there's no chance for any kind of dishonesty, any kind of shenanigans with it. Okay, so that's the principle that we're seeing here. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. I was going to mention Judas, but we'll come back to him in just a minute, because he's a demonstration of what Paul was making sure to avoid. But add to that verse 21 where he says, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. Paul says, and he makes the point very clearly here, that it's important to be honest before God, because God knows our hearts. He knows what is in man. He knows us inside and out. And so while it's important to do the right things outwardly, it's just as important to have the right attitude inwardly, to have the right heart, and to be honest and sincere and genuine in all that we do. But he also says that while it's important to do that for the Lord, it's also important to provide for honest things in the sight of men, because men don't know what's in our hearts. They can't see what we're thinking. They can't see our motives. Those things have to be demonstrated by our actions. And when they haven't been, or there hasn't been an opportunity to prove our motives, we have to act in such a way that it leaves as little room for dishonesty as possible, because we want to provide for things honest in the sight of God and of men. Okay, Paul made this statement in Romans 12:17. Recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. And he goes on at the end of that chapter in verse 21, he says, be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. So notice his instructions there. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. That's what Paul is trying to do in relation to the church at Corinth, their money and the contribution from these other congregations. He says we have to prove ourselves honest in dealing with this money. Okay, so excuse me. There is the temptation or the opportunity to be dishonest when it comes to money, when it comes to financial things. And Paul was well aware of that, and he wanted to make sure not only not to do things dishonestly. He asks in 2 Corinthians 12:17, did I make a gain of you by any of them whom I sent unto you? These men that he sent, Titus and these others that we've mentioned concerning this money, Paul asked, did I make anything from that? Was I sending them to you so I could get money from it? That's a question that people would ask, that those who are trying to undermine Paul and his authority, they're going to say, well, Paul got you to raise this collection because he's going to take some of it for himself. He sent these other men to encourage you to give and to give sacrificially because he wants money for himself. And Paul asked them the question here, did I do that? You see, he understood that men don't know your motives, and evil men have a tendency to project their evil motives onto others, even those who are doing good. So they say, no one would just do this out of the goodness of their heart. There's something in it for them. They're trying to, get the money for themselves. So they would use that to undermine Paul or anyone else who was doing good. And because men think that way and act that way, we have to work more diligently to create situations where there's no opportunity to be dishonest, and also to remove the temptation. So, when we take up the collection on Sundays, one person doesn't just take the money and go back into a back room and count it by themselves, right? It's several people, 3 or 4 different individuals. They go together and collectively they count the money. Why? Is it because we don't trust our brothers in Christ? No. But there's a temptation where if I'm the only one counting the money and no one's going to know how much money is in this collection plate except me, and, I'm a little short this week, and so I'm just going to take, a little bit out, and no one will ever know and no one will be the wiser. There's a temptation, right? And most people would probably never, do that or think of doing that, but remove the opportunity altogether. Because you're accountable, there are other people who are counting with you, right? So it's providing things honest. Even if the person, counting it is completely honest, you don't want a situation where someone could say, how do we know you're not taking a little, for yourself? That's what Paul is dealing with and getting at in this passage, that he had no dishonest intentions, but he wanted to make doubly and triply sure that no one could even find an occasion to accuse him. So you have, redundancy and backups to make sure that there's no way dishonesty could have taken place. And so we do the same thing. We put up a sheet on the bulletin board in the back with our contribution, how much comes in a month, what the expenses are, where that money goes to, and how much is left over at the end of the month. So there's honesty, there's accountability. We know how much is given. We know where the money goes. We know how much is left over. That's why our missionaries send out reports with all the congregations and how much money they contributed and where that money went to and how much is left at the end of the month. It's to keep us honest, and to give an honest account of how we're dealing with and using the Lord's money, providing things honest. Now, we might trust our evangelists, completely, but still you make those reports so there's no room for doubt or for questions. And that's what Paul is saying and emphasizing here. Provide things honest. Obviously in the sight of God, but especially we have to do it in the sight of men as well. So hold on to that thought. We're going to come back to it in just a moment. I want to read real quickly the end of the chapter, and then we'll make some final comments here. So he says in verse 22, "And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have oftentimes proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent upon the great confidence which I have in you." So here's another brother who's sent with them. And Paul again says about this brother, he is proved diligent oftentimes, not just once or twice, but he's demonstrated over and over again his diligence and his faithfulness. And then he says in verse 23, "Whether any do inquire of Titus," if you have questions about Titus, Paul says, "he is my partner and fellow helper concerning you." Paul says, "I will vouch for Titus. He's my partner. He's my fellow helper. We're in this together. We're of the same mind." So he's vouching for the character and the integrity of Titus. Then he says, "Or our brethren be inquired of," these other men who were coming with them. Here's what we know about them. "They are the messengers of the churches and the glory of Christ." So the churches, the congregations have selected these individuals. So they're not just some random person walking down the street. This congregation selected this individual, and this congregation selected this individual, and so they come with the endorsement of the congregation that sent them. They're messengers of the churches and the glory of Christ. "Wherefore," he says, "show ye to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf." So Paul says when they come, show them the proof of your love, how much you love God, how much you love Christ, how much you love the church, but also how much, Paul says, you love me and how much you love your brethren. Treat them like brethren is what he means, and demonstrate to them, by welcoming and accepting them, and also prove our boasting of you. So we've told them about how generous you are and the commitment you've made to giving this money. So, follow through and prove it, because we've said these things about you. So again, all of these statements have to do with providing things honest. So there's no room, for doubt or for question or for, anything like that. So that's, the heart of what this passage and this last part of this chapter is about. I want to mention a couple of things in connection with these last verses, and then we're going to talk about an example or two. When Paul says in verse 23, they are the messengers of the churches, that word messengers is the same Greek word for apostle. So if that word were used of Paul, it would be apostle. And that reminds us that the word apostle simply means one sent. Paul and Peter and John and the 12 apostles, they were the apostles of Christ. They were sent by him. They were his ambassadors. These men were apostles of the church. They weren't the apostles of Christ, but they were men sent by the church with the authority of the church to handle this money. Okay? So it's the same word, and it's used in the same way, except for the fact that there are only 13 apostles of Christ. 14 if you remove Judas and replace him with Matthias, if you still count Judas. 14. But they were specifically chosen by Christ to be his apostles, and they are the only apostles of Christ. But there were apostles of the churches, men chosen and selected by the churches and sent by them for a specific purpose and a specific mission. And that's who these are. And one more thing, verse 21, where it says providing for honest things, the American Standard Version, instead of honest, has the word honorable. And the Greek word here can mean either one. But I think it's just worth pointing out that for something to be honorable, it has to be honest. And if it's honest, then it is honorable. It means the same thing, and it's the same idea that Paul is, establishing here. So that's the key thought in this passage, to provide things honest. And I want to mention a couple of examples, and we'll bring this to a close. When you think of, on the bad side, I guess, of providing things honest, we think of someone like, in the Old Testament, you think of Achan's sin, how Achan coveted, the thing that was forbidden, and he took it and he hid it, and there was sin in the camp because of that. That was someone not providing things honest. He secretly took this thing and buried it, hid it under his tent, and brought trouble into Israel because of that. That's Joshua chapter 6, by the way. Not providing things honest. In the New Testament, we think obviously of Ananias and Sapphira, who wanted to look like, they were being honest when it came to their the money that they gave, but in fact they held some of it back for themselves, while claiming that they were giving it all. And because of that, they were not providing things honest. They were dishonest in what they were doing, and they were struck dead because of it in Acts chapter 5. And then, of course, there's Judas that I was going to mention a moment ago. Judas, he betrayed the Lord, obviously, but before he committed that terrible sin of betraying Jesus, the root of it started back with his dishonesty in relation to the money. The Bible tells us that Judas had the bag. He carried the money that was given and contributed to that group of apostles. And John tells us he was a thief. He was taking from the bag for himself. And so he was not providing things honest. Judas would take opportunities, to be alone with that collection of money and take some of it for himself. And that attitude has not disappeared from the world. You hear from time to time, as when we first started, we say it all the time in politics and in business and in sports and all the other areas of life. But you hear about it in the church too, about a preacher who has charge over the bank account or the contribution of the congregation, and it's found out that he's been, taking a little for himself. Sometimes the treasurer who has charge of those things. We hear about it happening, sadly. That sin, that attitude of covetousness, if it's not, taken care of and dealt with in a situation where you don't have the opportunity to do those things, so you provide things honest. If you don't have the opportunity to do it, you can't do it. You're not going to commit the sin. You still have to work on your heart, but you remove those opportunities to sin. But if that attitude, isn't corrected, it can grow into deeper and deeper sin, which is what happened to Judas. He was focused on the money and the material things, and when following Christ, he found out that wasn't going to equal money and material things. In fact, it meant sacrifice and persecution and a spiritual kingdom rather than a physical one. This wasn't the Messiah, that he thought it was. And so he betrayed him. And there have been Christians, preachers even, who have become so enamored of material wealth that they have corrupted the doctrine of Christ to teach things that are in error in order to either maintain, their paycheck, their material wealth, or to increase it. Because, face facts, if you preach the pure, unadulterated gospel, most people don't want that. If you want to, the big congregation with the big bucks, you're going to have to hold back on some of the things that you preach. It's just a fact of life, sadly. We wish it weren't that way, but it is. And many have been lost and led others into being lost because of that love of money. And so Paul is telling us that there is a danger here and a threat here. And so we need to create situations where we provide things honest in the sight of all men. And so Judas, is an example of the wrong side of that. And we need to learn from it. There are also good examples in the Bible. There's Barnabas, of course, the great encourager. Paul is a tremendous example of all the opportunities, that he had in connection with this contribution and so forth. And he went out of his way, above and beyond, to make sure that he was always accountable. There was always someone else there who could be an eyewitness to, that money and where it came from and where it was going, and that everything was above board until it got to the elders of the church at Jerusalem. He was very diligent about that. And that teaches us, the lesson that we need to be the same way when it comes to financial matters and to money in general, especially as Christians, because the world is looking for anything that it can use against us, any opportunity to criticize the church or the church leadership or a Christian in general. And we want to work diligently to make sure that we provide things honest. And I'll mention, just as we close here, a couple of maybe applications of this principle that are worth thinking about. We need to provide things honest when it comes to our money, as we've seen in this passage. But what about when it comes to everything that we do? We need to provide things honest in the sight of God and in the sight of the Lord. So, or in the sight of man. So when it comes to our when it comes to our, what we watch on television, are we providing things honest in the sight of men? Or are there things, that we wouldn't want others to see? The places that we visit on the internet, are we providing things honest in our business dealings with others? Are we honest when it comes to, what we tell someone? We're going to sell them something, so we don't tell them about all the faults or the problems with it. Or are we honest in our dealings with others? That's the principle that we're talking about here. I was looking over here. I had some notes, and I was trying to remember the story, but it was about a preacher who had a secretary, and when it would come time to do the bulletins or whatever, he would find an article that he liked, and he would give that article to the secretary, and he would tell her, this brother wrote that article, but take his name off of it and put my name on it, and put it in the bulletin or whatever, as though he had written it. And that may not seem like a big thing, but it's that principle of dishonesty. And no one else may have ever known that he didn't really write that article. It may have told the truth. It may have been, a good thing for someone to read, but it's the principle of being dishonest. And God is completely against dishonesty. In Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, the wise man talks about 7 things that God hates. And one of the things that God hates is a lying tongue. God hates dishonesty. He hates lying, and he hates it. In fact, it's mentioned twice in that list of those 7 things, dishonesty. But God hates it. He hates lying because of what it is, which is using falsehood with the intention of deceiving someone. The word means to cause an incorrect impression. And God doesn't want us to be false in our dealings with others. He hates lying because of what it is. He hates lying because of who he is. God cannot lie. Titus 1 and verse 2 tells us that. Why? Because it's against his nature. Imagine, you think about Jesus as he walked on this world, on this earth. Did he ever tell a lie? Can you imagine Jesus lying to someone? Of course not. Then why should we think that it's not a big deal to be dishonest? Provide things honest, because God hates lying. He hates it because of what it is. He hates it because of who he is. He hates it because it violates his nature. John 14 and verse 6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If Jesus is truth, then there's no dishonesty in him. John 17:17, thy word is truth. And so if we're going to live according to the word of God, we have to be people of truth. God hates lying because it is of the devil. John 8:44, you're of your father the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning and a liar. When he speaks, there's no truth in what he says because he's a liar and the father of it. Dishonesty comes from the devil, not from God. And God hates lying because it is a sin that condemns souls to eternal punishment. Revelation 21 and verse 8 lists all of those terrible sins, and then it says, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone. The second death. So dishonesty is displeasing to God. He wants us to provide things honest. So we need to be honest in our hearts with him, in our service to him. We need to be honest in our dealings with others. And we need to live in such a way that the world sees us as honest people. But we also need to provide things honest by, doing whatever we must to make sure that we don't create opportunities where someone can even, second guess us as it comes to our honesty. And, there are occasions, when things happen, and maybe you can't have every situation perfect, but we need to do everything that we can within our power to provide things honest. It comes back to the fact that we are Christians and that we as Christians have this wonderful privilege of taking the blessings that God has given us and using them to bless others. We don't want our good to be evil spoken of. We don't want this good thing that we're doing to become an opportunity of someone harming the church or the reputation of the church or the name of the church or of an individual Christian. And so provide things honest. And that's the point of Paul's message here. And it goes hand in hand with giving, that whenever we're talking about money, we also have to talk about honesty. So we need to be honest in our giving, and then we need to be honest in how that money is used and use it in the way that God instructs us to, and provide things honest. So I hope it's provided us something to think about in connection with this idea of honesty in our everyday lives. It's a very practical point that Paul makes here, and I hope that it's something that we'll think about in, as we go about our daily lives, that we're striving to be Christians and to show ourselves as Christians in everything that we do, and never give someone an opportunity to think that we're dishonest or don't have integrity in the way we conduct ourselves. So I hope that it's a lesson that will cause us to think and encourage us in, thinking seriously about our daily lives and the things that we go about doing. Thank you for joining us and being a part of this study. I hope it's benefited you. In our next lesson, we're going to start chapter 9, which is also a chapter about giving. And so we're going to shift to another focus, another perspective that Paul has on giving, which is just as powerful as these others. But we're going to look closely at the first part of that chapter in our next study. So I hope you'll be with us and join in with us for that time together. And we thank you and appreciate you being a part of this study, and hope you'll come back with us next time.